Welcome to Resiliency Within. I'm Elaine Miller-Karish, your host, and I'm very excited today. We are talking about the art of talking to children, a book that my guest recently published. Her name is Rebecca Rolland, and I'm going to give you a longer introduction to her and all her accomplishments. But before I do that, I think this is a really important time to talk with our children and learn different ways and maybe more effective ways to talk to our children, because there is so much going on in the world. I think we could certainly say with COVID that after over 2 years, there's been a lot of disconnection. There's been lots of trauma, grief that have pervaded not only our children's lives, but adult lives. And we know that adults are the tuning fork for their children. So we're all being impacted. So I think that what Rebecca Rolland shares with us, that we can learn ways to talk with children in ways that can bring out the things that they're concerned about, and ways that we can have meaningful conversations with them. And obviously that parents, teachers, and children's caregivers may be grappling with questions about how to talk to children right now, about war, about what's, just the last week in our media, about gun violence, or just even about grief and sadness, and also fear. So our show today will introduce listeners to the power of back and forth conversations with children as a way of promoting resilience and healing for both children and adults. Dr. Rolland, who is also, I think you get credibility on this, Rebecca, that you're a mother of 2 children.
Yes.
Yes, will offer listeners a toolbox of fun, playful, and actionable strategies and ideas to enhance their relationships with children. And also, and you know that if you've been listening to this show, we love neuroscience, and she's going to discuss the neuroscience behind these strategies. The session will support listeners in understanding just how powerful and urgent it is to have these meaningful conversations with children. Well, and Rebecca has quite a pedigree. She's a lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She serves on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. She is also an oral and written language specialist in neurology department of Boston's Children's Hospital. And she's a nationally certified speech language pathologist. She has worked clinically with populations ranging from early childhood through high school, and she's provided teacher professional development. She has her doctorate from Harvard Graduate School of Education, an MS in speech language pathology from MGH Institute of Health Professions, an MA in English from Boston University, and a BA in English from Yale. Phew, that was a lot to get through, Rebecca.
That's a lot of education. Yes.
You definitely have had a lot of education. So welcome to the show. We're so grateful that you're here today. And I'm just going to ask you kind of a question: is there anything on your mind right now before we start with some of the formal questions that we prepared together?
I would say that I do think just now, especially every day, obviously we read about news every day. I think things are really triggering for a lot of adults. And it's so hard to know, how do we talk to children about these things? How much of our own emotions, our own information do we bring to children? How much do we keep from them? And so I think this is just such an important time. And I think I feel this more and more every day in the parents I talk to, and even in my own family.
Well, and as you say that too, I'm just thinking about some of the gun violence and, sadly, the children who've lost their lives and all the community and family members that have impacted. Is that, how much do we say? Are there different things that we say at different developmental periods of our children? I was sharing with you that my daughter, I have a 5-year-old grandchild, and my daughter was worried that she would overhear kids at school talking. So she felt she had to say something to her, and yet didn't want to alarm her to be afraid of going to school. And so she actually decided to use the term "mean people sometimes come," and what to do if you see a mean person. So, I imagine that you might have some ideas about that, but I thought maybe I could start with that, because that may be something that many people are grappling with, is how do we talk about it? And sometimes it's hard to keep our children from the media that's so present in our lives if we just even turn on the television for a second.
Exactly. And I do think that I love what your daughter said she's doing, because it is all about finding that balance. So how do we tell them sort of what we think they might need to know at this time, especially based on what they've been hearing? What are they coming to us with? Do they come to us with fears? Are they overhearing something? And knowing that, it's better a lot of times if they can have that conversation first with us, rather than just we wait for something to be overheard, for some kind of information which may be distorted from their peers. So I think to realize that that can start at home as sort of a framing before they go out in the world can be so important.
Oh my gosh, I'm really glad that you said that, because I think that, in my experience with kids is they sometimes hear that and they craft their own meanings about it, and often can have distorted perceptions about what they've heard. And I think with what you're talking about, if the parent talks about it first, the parent can give their framework to the child that I think then can help allay some of their fears that they may have. Do you think that is yeah, true?
Exactly. I think that that's so important, so that they can almost have a filter rather than just going through and, they pick something up here and something else there, and they want to make sense of it. So they may make a really distorted sense of it if they have nothing that's grounding them. So I think we can think about our conversations as really grounding.
Well, first of all, I want to say, and I'm going to probably say it many times in the show, I just love the name of your book, The Art of Talking with Children. And it was just published in March. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Exactly. Yes.
And I mean, I was very impressed because you've already told me that it's being published in many languages. So,
yes. Yeah. It just came out in India in English, and it's being translated in Chinese, Spanish, Vietnamese, lots of other languages as well.
So I want our listeners to know that, because if you have a family member that does not speak English, to know that's available in many languages. And if you're concerned about, let's say, a family member and how they speak to their children, you might want to buy the book and say, oh, you might want to read this book. I just heard this person on Resiliency Within on Voice America. So, I'm really curious, Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit about your journey in focusing on the art of speaking with children?
Yes, definitely. So it's interesting because I've always been really interested in language. I started out actually in high school as a poet. So I really love writing poetry and have been publishing poetry and teaching it much of my life, actually.
You have to send me some of your poetry.
Oh, yeah. I have a poetry book, actually. I published my first book, was 10 years ago. So I've started out that way. And I actually just became fascinated, not just with language and writing, but then just even with the language people are speaking every day. So I started really paying attention to how people were talking. And I realized it was just really fascinating to me. So I had a writing teacher actually give an exercise to say, just sit in a cafe and write down what people are actually saying. And I was like, I don't need to do that. I know what people generally say. But actually, when I did the exercise, I was fascinated because people did not at all say what I thought they would say, and in the ways I had expected them to say it. And I encourage anyone who's listening to actually try that, because it is a really interesting and almost humbling experience to actually hear the ways people interact with each other through language.
Well, that is so fascinating. As you're saying that, I'm going, oh, well, what if you went to different neighborhoods?
Oh, for sure.
Different languages that are spoken. So, my mother was from El Salvador. So she would sometimes, bring in English and Spanish words together. I guess they call it Spanglish, right?
Yes, exactly.
So I imagine that happens with many, many different languages.
Definitely. Yes. It's so fascinating. And even what I think is even cooler is that to notice the effect that even having you or having a listener, how that might change the conversation as well. So I think when you actually come and sit down, like whether you're closer, if somebody's going to change what they were saying, lower their voices, just how the effect of having an observer also changes the conversation, which I think was really interesting.
Well, I'm often interested in why people became passionate about this work. It certainly sounds like you had some wonderful instructors that gave you some really interesting assignments, but what issues did you notice in society that prompted you to be passionate about this work?
Yeah, so definitely as I became a teacher, I became really interested in helping children who were having trouble speaking. So I actually realized the power of language, not just as a mode of expression, but really as a form of authenticity. So actually allowing children to have their voices heard, to allow adults to have their voices heard through parenting, through communicating with children. And I realized there were so many obstacles to this kind of authentic communication. It was just felt as if there was sort of a perfect storm of factors. I mean, everything from technology, constant news media, just busy schedules, and even the emphasis on kind of everyone having activities a lot of the time. I realized people often were having really logistical conversations. And I found myself doing this in my own life, kind of focusing conversations around, well, let's get here, let's get your gym clothes, let's get this. But then at the end of the day, it didn't feel as though we had made the time or really had been thoughtful about having some more meaningful conversations.
Well, I'm from a different generation completely, but I remember the importance of the family dinner hour. and that we were there, and that's when we would process our day. But now I often see, even in my own family, that everybody's on a device. I mean, we actually try to get rid of the devices, although sometimes it's not easy. And that's not the kids, that's the adults.
Yes,
And
yes.
so that also, then people are never like paying attention to
Exactly.
the individuals in their homes. So
yeah, and there's actually, it's funny because I've read articles about this. They call it kind of alone together, where we're all sitting together, but we're really not with
we're
each
not
other.
connecting. We're not connecting. So, well, let me ask you another question. You've talked about how now there are perfect storms of factors leading children and adults to feel disconnected and in need of meaningful conversations. Can you tell more about that? I guess we just touched upon it. Would you like to say more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think especially a lot of parents that I've heard come to me and say, my child just seems shut down, or it's like my child disappears to their room, they come for dinner and then they leave to their room again, or things like that. And there's just this urge from the parent side to connect more with the child. But what's funny is that I often see kids and I realize the urge is also there with the child. So it's so funny because we think, oh, we're both wanting to connect, but there's just this difficulty in terms of, well, how do we make this happen? And that's really where I saw my work as helping, especially just kind of how do we reconnect when we both want to, or when, both children and adults want to, but it can be really hard to know how.
Well, it's so interesting. I was just thinking about when my kids are in their, late 30s now, right? And so I would just remember my son, because when he was a teenager, I'd say, well, how was school? Fine. What did you do today? Nothing. Any interesting subjects? No. I mean, that was a conversation, except we were fortunate enough to have a hot tub. Hey, mom, do you want to go in the hot tub with me? I said, sure. Oh my gosh, he became the most talkative person on earth. But it wasn't outside of there's something about that made it, I don't know. I mean, I would love your interpretation of that.
Yes, that's great. That's so funny. And I think that goes to what I've seen with a lot of families, which is just that if we can develop these kind of rituals, which usually involve something kind of meditative or relaxing or quiet or calming, that can be one place where things just open up. And it's almost as if it's a ritual that kids know and they're comfortable with, and they associate it with opening up. So it becomes this thing they look forward to. I have the same thing in my family. I take my daughter for walks to the cafe because she likes to go. I get a tea and she gets something to eat or something. And she's like, let's go for our little walk, and she knows that at that point, we're going to have time to actually communicate.
And the thing about that is that I can remember sometimes going, oh, I've got so much to do. But I just said, no, I got to do it because maybe he wants to talk to me about something.
Right. Exactly.
I think that's the thing here of a busy life. You go, oh my God, I don't have time to go for the walk or the hot tub, or whatever it might be. So, let me ask you another question. So what do you see as the connection between the back and forth conversation and resilience for both adults and children?
Yeah, so I think what's so important is just this idea of being responsive. So we often think about maybe resiliency as kind of a really big topic of like, oh, well, we want this as an outcome. But what we don't always see is how it develops out of these very small moments and very small interactions that accumulate over time. So it's not just that obviously we're going to have resiliency and, this one activity, or those things are important, but that even just taking the time to sit and really understand what a child is saying from moment to moment and having them understand what you're really trying to say is really key for developing that resiliency in the long term.
Well, I have a question for you. I think it might be important to find out what is your definition of resiliency, because I've interviewed a number of people and lots of people have different, definitions of the word. So can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I do see there's a range of definitions as well. So I think the standard one that I'm used to using is sort of the ability to bounce back from difficult experiences, the ability to see and recognize one's strengths, and to really have a strengths-based approach to one's life and to hardships. So the ability to kind of get through and really think through relying on one's strengths, and also the ability to ground oneself and feel grounded in one's environment, in one's selfhood, even through challenging or destabilizing experiences. So all of that for me is kind of the constellation.
Yes. And I keep adding to it too, like, it doesn't mean that we don't talk about suffering, but what else is true? And that is the strength base, right? It's like, what else are your strengths? But so, and also with these conversations, I'm also, noting that, sometimes we want to talk to our children, they don't want to talk to us. Are there strategies that you've learned on how to kind of increase the likelihood that they might want to talk to us when we're going, give me something, it's like,
Yes, yes.
oh yes,
Yes, there are a couple. So one thing is I would really focus on is actually looking at the time, not time of day necessarily, although that's part of it, but really not always feeling as if we need to have this conversation now. So maybe it isn't the right time, and feeling as if we can pull back and saying, okay, well, maybe we'll wait until a time where it feels more relaxed, where my child is more in the mood to talk. So sometimes we get kind of in a panic about, well, I want to have this conversation now, and it doesn't always have to happen now. The second thing I would really emphasize is just modeling. So even if kids don't want to talk, I often find that by talking through my day, even in things that I don't think are incredibly interesting, and that just my children like to listen. It seems they like to listen. And then at some point they interrupt me and they want to have their side of the conversation. So
that's really nice. Now, there's another question that I want to ask you, and that is about texting. Now, for example, I have one of my children, and that my child would rather text me than talk to me. And so, and that's an older child, but we have great conversations, and probably maybe better conversations when we're texting another. So what is your comment about that, and how early is that okay, or should we try not to do that? I mean, I just think like we have to talk about technology if we're talking
yes,
about
definitely. And it's funny that you said that, because I was just going back in the car from a long car trip, and my daughter texted me, I want a bunny, in the car. And I said, I hear you texting me, you want a bunny. We talked about that. And it was really
sometimes
good.
it's easier to say it on text than it is to say it in person,
It's like, I know you want a bunny, but yeah. So, but actually, yeah. So I would say that, that for me, technology is a great part of our relationship if it's a part and an adjunct to a real life relationship. So in that example, I think it was funny because it was, obviously we're both in the car together. She knows that she can say this, and it's another way of communicating. So for me, I'm really all about the importance of communicating, whatever way that happens. And if that happens sometimes in a way that's more flowing in a text-based fashion, I don't have a problem with it, as long as it's not, then I don't talk to my child, in person.
Because you're only texting.
That's your only texting.
Well, because I'm wondering too, knowing, your background as speech pathologist, and in terms of that social engagement piece between two people actually being live together,
Yes.
or even on Zoom. I mean, I think we can have meaningful conversations, obviously, but there seems to be something to me that I worry about losing that person-to-person connection, because there's so much more to conversation than the words.
Oh, yes. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because in my book, I talk about what's called embodied face-to-face conversation. Yeah, which is not my term, actually. So yeah, I reference all of that, but I do think it's so critical. So I think that is really key. And that's why I emphasize in some ways texting as an adjunct, because I think that it's almost like vitamins. If you think about vitamins as a supplement to an otherwise healthy diet, I think it can be fine. But if you're taking vitamins and not really eating actual good food, that's not going to be very good for your body. So that's the way I sort of think about texting and technology, is that if it's adding to something that's already robust in terms of our in-person conversation, I think it can be helpful. But if it's sort of taking the place of, but I do think it's sort of the meat and potatoes of our relationships, because we can see facial expressions, you can see gestures, you can be more, you can think about repairing conversations in different ways in person. So,
well, I just had the experience. I've been pretty much staying at home for 2 years, and I went on my first trip. I went to Northern Ireland last week, and it was so delightful to be in person with people. I miss it, and I didn't realize how much I missed it until I didn't have it. And I imagine that children too, that are, have gone back to school in person, that's a different experience for them than being like we're talking right now, because there's so many nuances of how we communicate that I think, as much as I think Zoom is a wonderful way to communicate, for example, or being on the air like we are right now with Voice America, there's so many other parts to it. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Definitely. And I do think I see it all the time now with kids who are back in person, is that there are so many delights for them. I think they're so excited, many of them. There are also a lot of anxiety and a lot of missed chances that we need to help them catch up on. I mean, I've seen so many kids who almost, even the 5-year-olds, like my son who's 5 hadn't really had a play date for as long as he could remember. And so when getting back, he's like, what is this thing we call the play date? What am I going to do on this play date? And his sister, who's 10, was like, this is ridiculous. What do you, but we think about, you don't always think that young kids, they haven't even had the social experience if they've been in the COVID period. So
I'm just laughing because my granddaughter, I would take her for walks and she would see a child walking with a parent across the street and she'd go, hi, my name is Madison. And I just felt so sorrowful because
oh my goodness,
I couldn't get close to them, but she hungered for those kinds of connections. So I'm glad to hear that those are still very important.
Yes. Oh yes. I think it's critical. And yeah, I mean, my son would call, we had construction outside our house for, 3 months or something. And he would go and say, these are my friends, the construction workers, because they were hanging out outside our house. Yeah. And so you do think kids are longing for friendships and they'll make friends even if they're not real friends. So
we had a worker come to our house. It was the same thing. That worker came on such a regular basis. That was her only friend.
Oh, wow.
And he was always so sweet to her. So that was nice. But, this kind of leads me into the next question, which is you talk in your book about rich talk as a way to jumpstart meaningful conversations. Could you talk a little bit more about what that is?
Yes, definitely. So this is the framework that I put in the book, and it's really intended to help people see, well, sort of how can you have these meaningful conversations and how can it be not a huge investment of time or energy, but just something you can do every day. And there's the ABCs of rich talk, which I lay out in the book, and I'll just talk about them briefly if that's
I would love to hear about the ABCs because I think it's important for us to know what those are. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. So the A is stands for adaptive, meaning that you're really going with the flow of your child, both in the moment. So in terms of their mood, are they in a talkative mood? Are they in more of a quiet or shut down mood? You're kind of matching that as well as longer term. So meaning thinking about temperament, for example, are they more active in the morning or are they more talkative after they've played basketball, say, something like that. So you're really starting to grow with them in terms of what do they need conversationally. B stands for back and forth. So oftentimes we talk at kids sometimes about thinking about it or even to them, but not necessarily with them. And there's a lot of research, especially from MIT in the last couple of years, that has really found the importance of back and forth talk, meaning that the child says something, the adult says something, child says something back, etc. So there's this kind of ping-ponging effect where you really are getting engagement, both from the child and from the parent. And that is just so powerful in building children's skills. And C stands for child-driven. So this doesn't mean permissive parenting, anything like that, or permissive education, but it really just means that starting conversations with where a child is. That might mean on the positive side, they're very excited, they want to tell you something, but even something that you sense is on their mind or something they're worried about or scared about, you're really trying to understand their perspective on the situation before necessarily coming in and just lecturing. So I think those ABCs are really what I put together as something to really jumpstart those conversations.
This kind of leads me to a question, because sometimes I've seen this, even sometimes, if you're going to the supermarket and you see an adult talking to, let's say, a 3-year-old, and they're saying something to the 3-year-old, and I don't think the child has the cognitive capacity to understand what the parent is saying. Mm-hmm. And then you can see the parent's frustration starts to rise because the child can't quite comprehend what the parent is trying to tell them. I wonder if you could just address that. And what do we need to know about developmental ages and about cognitive abilities to even understand what we're talking about in terms of conversation?
Definitely. Yeah. So I think that is so important. And one thing to keep in mind is I usually think the more concrete, the younger the child. So oftentimes I think we can talk about big ideas if you start very concrete with something the child can actually see. So you wouldn't be talking about, say, gravity with a 4-year-old, but you could talk about, oh, this one falls really fast and this one falls less fast. We talk that it's a word called gravity. So you can get there, you can get to big ideas, but you always want to start thinking, especially however young the child is, something that they can actually see and manipulate. So that's one thing I really keep in mind.
So really keeping in mind that tangible things that a child can touch.
Exactly. And especially, I think with your example, it's so important that sometimes we will get it wrong, but that not to necessarily ramp it up and feel more frustrated, but just take the temperature. So maybe say something, and I've done this before. I sometimes try, I say something to my 5-year-old and I realize like, I'm curious, do you understand what I'm saying? And I'll see what he says. And obviously that's the power of this back and forth, is that you can see, oh, wow, you have a really different understanding than I thought you did, or you don't. And just being open as an adult to not necessarily get really frustrated about the child's level, but to just start to really listen to their responses to see, if you need to go up and down.
So I think it's like being curious, and also I guess it would be also watching our language, that if we're using, language that they don't yet comprehend, and like you're saying, checking it out, they may not have any idea about what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think also to realize that they might, in a surprising way, you might be surprised positively and be like, wow, they have, there's something really cool in what you said, and I mean, my son actually just recently asked me, like, when does the future start? And it was funny because I realized it was because he wanted a package that we said is coming in the future. So he was asking when the future was, but I took it as much more philosophical. And I was like, well, I mean, it could start tomorrow, but it could also start in 5 minutes. And like, what, it's just, so we started trying to lay out on paper, like, here's now, and then here's after now, which is, so, but it's cool. I think sometimes you can see really interesting.
I love those conversations, because sometimes what they're asking us is a lot more concrete than what.
Exactly. I realized later, I was like, you just want the monopoly. Like, when is monopoly coming?
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't really about an esoteric thing about.
Right, exactly.
Sure. And here you've got it.
Yeah, it's really funny.
Who knows that little mind is being formed, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then what's wrong with doing something?
Yeah, exactly.
Because my granddaughter often surprises me. She'll use an incredibly, I mean, how do you know that vocabulary?
Right.
And I think it might be because of social media. I'm not certain. Mm-hmm. That's definitely more expanded than when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm. And even television. I was surprised by some things. They listen to Blaze, or there's various kids shows where they really talk about technical things, and you'd be surprised.
I think the technology, and I think maybe we can talk a little bit more about that after the break. You're talking about your 10-year-old daughter who is very good with technology.
Yes.
And I'm talking about my son when the internet first came out. Like,
yes, that's amazing.
Talking another language, and he still to this day will go, "Oh, Mom, I can't believe you don't know that." I am pretty good with technology, but yes, of course he's better. He ended up getting his degree in that.
Oh, for sure.
So at any rate, we're going to be back in just a few moments. We're going to continue this really fascinating talk with Dr. Rebecca Rolland, and we're going to learn more about how to talk with kids, because she's got a lot of goodies up the sleeves for us, so that we can start strategizing and how we're going to implement this, not only with maybe our children, our grandchildren, or kids we know in the neighborhood, or if you're a teacher, kids that you are caring for, or I think your book is for really all of the world. So, and that name of that book, I'm going to say it again, The Art of Talking to Children. All right. We'll be back in just a few minutes, and we will continue our conversation.
Great. Thanks.
Welcome back. I'm here talking to Rebecca Rolland. She's written the most wonderful book that has been published in many languages called The Art of Talking to Children. And so we were talking at the break about how I really wanted to hear more about the neuroscience behind the work that she's doing, and the conversations with children, and how to build resilience. So Rebecca, could you tell us a little bit more about the neuroscience behind, these conversations that we can facilitate with kids?
Definitely. Yeah. So as part of my book, I really undertook a journey of research. So I talked with and met with many experts in neuroscience and linguistics, psychology, and so on, just because I was so fascinated to learn this myself. And one thing I found, I met with Rachel Romeo at MIT, and she and her lab have done some fascinating research on the neuroscience of conversations, especially. And something she did actually was she recently did an intervention study, where it was a 9-week study where she actually found that you can enhance the number of conversational turns with children. So she did a study with parents and children. You can enhance these turns, so you can have more back and forth just by teaching about it. And that by doing so, there's a link to children's enhanced language skills, but even their activation of the language part of their brain and the social part of their brain. So really the fact that conversation isn't just a linguistic experience, but it's also a social experience. So children are actually learning how to kind of be in relationship in conversation, even as they're learning what we think of as more, language skills like vocabulary and things.
So when you talk about activation, did she actually peek inside and do
So
MRI?
yeah, there was actually like fMRI studies and various studies that they've done to notice sort of what's activating at, at what period. So yeah, so it was actually a neuroscientific study as well as an intervention study. So when she actually taught adults how to do this, which I thought was really fascinating because we don't always think about, are we able to make changes in these kind of areas, which she found that we were. So that just actually came out last year. So it was really, really recent.
So, and I'd certainly like to read that. So tell her name is, I love her name.
Oh yeah, Rachel Romeo, R-O-M-E-O.
Easy one to remember,
Yeah, exactly.
Romeo. And so you were also mentioning that in the Harvard labs that there may be, could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think we also know that having a trusted adult.
Yes. So I would really point listeners to that center because it's great. The Center for the Developing Child at Harvard. And Jack Shonkoff, who's a pediatrician, is one of the main researchers there. And they do just really wonderful work. And they call it serve and return conversations, where it's really this idea that having these back and forth conversations is building the brain, but is also building trust, building relationships at the same time. And that's something I talk in my book about, what I call a double promise, because we think about it's happening in the moment. So you're sort of enjoying each other in the moment. And then you're also building the skills and resiliency over time. So there's kind of these two things happening simultaneously, which I think is just incredible.
Well, and as you talk, and I love that, the double promise is that, Rebecca, but it does concern me about technology when you say that, because if we know to develop healthy brains that this conversation needs to happen, if we have children that are so fixated on that device that's so addicting, as we know, I know we talked about it earlier, but I'm just wondering, are they looking at this Harvard lab, for example, what's happening with the brains of kids that are just so fixated on that and not in the conversation?
Yes, I mean, I think, so I definitely have read a lot of research about this as well. And I do think that the unfortunate thing is that children who are already at risk socially, being more on social media, being more vulnerable, online, makes them even more at risk. So I think that we want to be particularly concerned. For example, they found that, young teenage girls who are already concerned about body image or concerned about how well they're liked, they do a lot more social comparisons, for example, using Instagram and so on, which causes them to feel even worse about themselves. So there is this kind of cycle where, we're seeing that children are getting more concerned, more insecure by being more on social media, especially if they were already vulnerable to it. So I think we want to be especially careful, for me, not just technology writ large, but what are kids using technology for? So, one example for me is we've started playing as a family the New York Times spelling bee, which is what you try to all find these words in a little spelling bee. So now we have like a morning conversation about these different words. And, that's one example of we're using technology, we're on the phones, but it's not the same thing as somebody scrolling through TikTok, looking at various videos.
It's a collaboration that also stimulates conversation.
Exactly. So if I really think about, well, is there more conversation and connection happening as a result of this technology use, or is there more disconnection? So I really think about that in a more nuanced way than just technology is good or technology is bad. It's really, what are we using that technology for?
Oh, that is so important. What are we using the technology for? I haven't heard anybody say that before, because I think people are concerned about the social media, but if you do something collaboratively, like, that word scramble game, then you're going to be conversing and you're going to be doing the back and forth that you say is so important.
Exactly. So I think, we're saying, oh, well, did you get this word? No, I already did that. Oh, okay. What about this? And so, yes, we're using a screen, but it's a jump start to conversation. So rather than saying in the morning, oh, I'm tired. What are you at? We're having a different kind of conversation. So
it can be kind of fun.
It's very fun. It's very fun. Although it can end in tears, unfortunately, once in a while, but
here's the part of life too.
Hopefully not. Yeah. It's a borderline. It's always the border.
I come back to teenagers, because we're so concerned about teenagers right now. We know that the depression rates in teenagers is very high. Suicide rates are very high. Yes. So when a teenager is fixated, like you said, young teenage girls, what are some ways that parents can start this back and forth conversation with them. Can you give us some examples, some tools that I'm sure many people are going, oh, what do I do with my
Yes,
kid who doesn't talk to me?
definitely. Yes, for sure. And I think one thing that I really like to emphasize from the beginning as sort of a foundation is, if it's at all possible, to help engage your child as a collaborator with you in thinking about how technology is making them feel, how they're using it, and what they're, what they're doing afterwards, how their relationships are. So rather than saying, well, I'm going to be the person who sets the rules, I'm going to ban your phone from you, and sort of setting up a antagonistic relationship, if you can help your child even with the smallest things as a start. So things like, well, let's think about, let's just try something. How do you feel after you've been on that app for 20 minutes? How much do you think, if you say, well, I need to be on it because my friends are on it, something like that. Well, how much do you think you, quote unquote, need to be on it before it's enough? Can you help set your timer for yourself and say, well, that's what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to do something else? Can we help each other be on our sort of use social media only as much as we feel like it's benefiting us, and be a little bit self-critical about it? So, and do it for yourself too. I mean, I think a lot of adults, we do use social media maybe more than we might need to also. And so
my granddaughter recently, nobody could find their phones. She had stuck into and got everybody's phones, and she hid them from us.
oh no,
And I thought that was brilliant on her
it's
part.
so funny. Yes.
To me, I think that was part of like, how can we communicate with
Right,
her?
right.
And
Exactly.
on our technology.
Right. I think she was saying that.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
Going, well,
Yeah.
we got to get rid of our
Yeah.
technology if this
Exactly.
is what's going on, right? Because
Yeah.
we've got
Oh
to
yeah.
spend time.
Yeah. And actually, I'd like to point, there is a really fascinating research I read, which was, I'm sad, which was with younger children, but saying that children, especially, they interact with you less as an adult if you're on your phone, but especially if it's a habitual thing for the adult. So meaning, as if the child recognizes that this is just something you do, you're not going to engage with them, so they don't even try. So they found that children were actually making less bids for attention. Yeah. So it's almost as if okay, I'm going to check the weather quickly. But no, if they know you're habitually on your phone when they're habitually playing, they start to make fewer and fewer attempts to communicate, because it's just, why should I try?
Oh my gosh, I want everyone to hear that.
Yeah.
So if they see you on your phone a lot when you're with them, then it's almost like they're saying, I guess they're not interested in me.
Right. Or it's like, why do I need to try? Because they don't really want to talk. So I try less. So then sometimes when people say, well, they're just playing over there, they don't even want to talk. Well, it's like, well, yes, maybe, but maybe it's also because we're always on the phones. They know not to look. They know not to ask at this point. So that's when I think something should probably change.
Yeah, no, I think so. But are there any other things with teenagers? Any other things that you've learned?
Yes, definitely. So I think especially this idea of isolation, I think teenagers think they're connecting through the kind of phone use and social media use, but there's so much research showing that sadly, that even if you put something neutral, like you start with a neutral feed on Instagram, it very quickly goes to something more and more negative and extreme. So children are being exposed to more and more extreme images, whether it's things about eating disorders, things about others who are, more beautiful, that kind of thing, very, very early, even if they're not posting that kind of content. So I think that's something we want to be really concerned about, is just what are teenagers being exposed to in their feeds, even if they're not necessarily putting it out there.
Because aren't there algorithms too that
Exactly.
they have, and that can be not good for our children.
Yeah, so they tend to go more and more towards one extreme or the other, just because that's what gets clicks and things like that. So it can be really disturbing, and we don't always know, obviously, what kids are going through or scrolling through. So I think that's why the conversation is so important, because we do want to help kids raise their self-awareness so that they can start to monitor their own feelings and emotions, and not to feel as if we're the ones banning or not banning, because then they just do more sneaking of phones and things like that. So it's not as useful.
So, and this we've kind of touched upon this a little bit, but I think it deserves a deeper dive. Are there common misconceptions about talking with children? If so, what are some key ones, and how can we bust the myths?
Yes, definitely. So I think one thing is this idea that we do just want to get more out of kids. So it's like, how can we ask more questions? More questions will mean they talk more. And then why won't they talk more? So I think we can get very triggered when kids don't want to talk. And it feels as if, well, why won't they talk to me? There's a bigger problem. I think to stay relaxed in those moments and to realize that silence and kind of active listening can be as important as questions or talking. I've often found that some of the best conversations come after I'm purposefully silent after picking my children up from school. So rather than, how was your day? What did you do? Those are fine. Those are, moments of connection in themselves. But I found that if I do want, to hear more about their day, sometimes actually just being silent and waiting for them to come up with whatever's on their mind can be a really important jumpstart. And I think that's true for a lot of other times as well.
But Rebecca, when you say that too, based on your previous comments, that means silence, not silence being on your social media.
Exactly. Yes.
So you have to move that aside.
Yes, just to move that aside.
Have some, I don't know, 15 minutes an hour.
Even just to do something even meditative together, or something like, not necessarily just sit in silence, but, do some cooking, do some, let's play some cards, let's do whatever kind of ritual is kind of, together, that sort of, you might be quiet together, but doing something. Oftentimes that's when conversations can bubble up.
I've noticed that with my granddaughter, where I like to plant flowers, and she likes to do it with me, and she'll talk to me then about things that I didn't know were going on. But it's like you're doing something else, but that causes that back and forth conversation that you're saying is important.
Exactly. And sometimes I find that, even sitting in the car with someone, when you're not necessarily facing each other, sometimes that can be easier to start harder conversations, because it feels as if, okay, I'm not in your face, we're sort of doing our own thing visually, but you can sometimes talk a little bit easier.
Well, and I've heard some parents tell me that they have no talking no using media in the phone, in the car rather.
In the car.
Because there are conversations that can be had in the car that sometimes it's kind of like going into the hot tub with my son, that there can be special moments of conversation because it can be mixed with silence.
Exactly.
Conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's long stretches of silence, and something can come up. And even talking about things that are concrete, you can talk about what you're seeing outside. So always, it's important if we're having especially difficult conversations, to have these moments of lightness, to say, well, let's look at this, or let's, which way should we go? Or, so I think those kinds of things to break up sometimes difficult conversations can be really important too.
Well, it seems like when I was talking about what I often term as invitational language. You're inviting them to have a conversation with you. And that's different than saying, tell me about what happened in school today, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes I do even have kind of things that, where I'll say, oh, this really funny thing happened to me today. And I'm not sort of planning it, but, you think, oh, this funny thing. And oftentimes that brings up, well, this funny thing happened to me, so kids do want to engage often if they're given that invitation, for sure.
Yes. Because I'm thinking about all these things where I might say to Madison, you're not going to believe what Papa Jim did today. Papa Jim.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a playful thing that we do together, right?
That's really funny.
So these kind of conversations that you can have. So I'm really getting the sense too. It's also as the parent or grandparent or the caregiver of children is also being aware of yourself. That's really come through in our conversation.
Definitely. I think too that, to recognize especially kind of what's triggering for us, when are we able to have some difficult or, some of our best conversations. And especially sometimes I think kids want to have conversations when we don't necessarily want to have them, or we're not ready for them. And I talk in my book too about this idea of bookmarking conversations. So meaning that, it's fine to say, well, I think we should talk about that, but I don't feel ready to talk about that right this second, so why don't we wait? And then I usually try to set some kind of time or put it on a schedule somewhere. So say like, I think I'll be ready later tonight. Can we talk about that at bedtime? Or so then that way you're saying to your child, or to what, the child you're with, this is important. I value what you're asking me. I value this idea, but I just right now emotionally, like, this is not the time for me, or we don't have the time for this. So that bookmarking is really making the time, but in a way that's sort of going to be the best for both of you. So I think that is so important.
So creating language within your family about bookmarks was important. That's also modeling that sometimes we're not in our best selves to be able to have a conversation.
Yeah.
But their conversation is important to you, but not at this moment in time.
Exactly. And I think same goes for apologizing. So I really emphasize how important it is to model apologizing, to have that be part of the family where it's okay to apologize. And I think that can make things feel easier. You can say something that you feel is wrong or not the way you want it if you can apologize.
Well, so there's also some topics that, if you could just share a little bit more with us about the recent, the shootings in Uvalde where all the children died and 2 teachers died.
Yeah.
The other thing about that is that, I actually wrote a psychology blog, Psychology Day, about it, was that in 2020, the last time they have the statistics that were available to me, there were over 4,000 children under the age of 18 and under, who had died from gun violence.
Wow.
And so, yes, the mass shootings are horrible, but there's children dying every single day in different parts of our neighborhoods from gun violence.
Yes.
So how do we talk to kids about this? What if they're afraid? What if they're afraid to?
Oops. You've just frozen. Let's see. Has everything frozen, or is it just?
I'm not sure.
Now you're.
It was frozen, yes.
Can you hear us now, Matt?
I've got you both.
Okay.
For what it was. So anyway, we can say a little bit more about this conversation.
Definitely. Yes. And I actually have written about this as well, because I think that it is so important. And especially today, I think we can't avoid it. I mean, we don't want to avoid it. And I think it's a sad reality of our lives and of our children's lives. And one thing I think that's so important to keep in mind is just to help kids realize that we are trying our best to keep them safe, that what our schools are trying their best to keep them safe. But I think always finding that balance of compassion for all of the people that have been affected, and also, well, how do we feel okay and safe enough in our own lives? And so for me, what I've really found important is to emphasize 3 parts of empathy. So not just empathizing, sort of feeling into other people's perspective, but also what can we do? So I really think that in terms of talking with children about violence, it's very important, at least from my perspective, to take an action-oriented viewpoint, to say, we're not just going to sit here passively. Yes, this is happening. Yes, you probably have seen these images. And we'll think about, both in our own lives and homes, but even at the broader political spectrum, what can we actually do about this? So what can I do as an adult? How can I help to make this so it doesn't seem as scary, as much of a reality? So I do think that validating the fact that children are scared, and while recognizing that we're here for them, that we want to hear their concerns, and that we're doing our best to keep them safe, I think all of those are critically important. But I also think we need to take the other step of saying, well, we are trying to take action here because we don't think this is the kind of society we want you to grow up in. We do want to make changes. And I think to have children hear that the adults in their lives want things to be different is also really important for kids.
So you're talking really about empowering them to think about how you can take action. Maybe it would be writing to your legislator and saying, I do not want guns coming into my school, right?
Exactly. So yeah, to say that we agree this is not a good situation. This shouldn't be happening to anyone ever. And what can we do at a small scale, even to make the smallest difference, to feel as if we can start to move towards a different society? So I think that is really important to empower kids.
And so I'm also getting a clear message from you. It's not avoiding the subjects.
Yes, I think that that's so important. I think that kids are, of course, naturally scared. And I think that to feel as if we can share our own upsetness with them, to hear from them, I think to hear and just to be with them, with their feelings, and to validate them, I think is so important, because it's true that it's scary to hear that. And I think to tell kids that it's not scary is to do them a disservice.
Well, I cannot believe our time today has slipped by like quicksand. It's been such a really fabulous conversation.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm hoping that maybe you'll come back again and we can continue this conversation. But are there any parting thought, one parting thought?
Yes, sure. So I would say that if the idea of meaningful talk with kids, if that feels big or, feels like a, big undertaking, I would say absolutely, it doesn't have to be. You can take 5 minutes a day, a couple times a day. Just start by sitting with your child, doing something, quiet, and seeing what happens, just really starting to hear from them. What is it that's on your mind today? You don't have to say that, but just to really get that sense from them. And I think you might be really surprised the richness that your conversations take.
Well, I want to remind all of our listeners that your book is available on Amazon and I'm sure other places. It is The Art of Talking to Children by Rebecca Rolland. Please go and buy it and read it, and we will have her come back again. Rebecca, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I think this is another example. You often hear me say, what else is true? What else is true if we're worried about talking to our children? We have just heard some really great examples of what we can do, even if it's 5 minutes twice a day, to try to engage in that back and forth conversation that clearly is so important to us. So Rebecca, again, thank you so much. And my listeners, until we meet again, this is Elaine Miller-Karras signing off for Resiliency Within.